Hello, welcome to Inspiratia's latest webcast. This is the first in a new series looking at battery storage in partnership with the law firm Gowling WLG. I'm Alex Blackburn and I lead Inspiratia's renewables coverage in London. For this episode I'm joined by Helen Emmerson, a partner in Gowling's real estate team, and Roberto Castiglioni, a senior investment director at Ingenious Infrastructure and managing director of Argonaut Power. The three of us sat down in late September at Gowling's London Bridge offices on the bank of the Thames and started by talking about grid-connected batteries or front of the meter. The latest figures put the UK's installed capacity at around 350 megawatts, driven largely by 2016's Enhanced Frequency Response auction. Looking ahead, the project pipeline is said to be somewhere close to 8 gigawatts, but investors talk about a lack of clarity in the regulation and say that arguably the biggest barrier to investment is the lack of revenue visibility over the medium term, let alone the long term. That's why some market players, including my two guests, have gone behind the meter, signing or advising on deals with large energy users to install batteries and other forms of on-site generation as a way to lock in energy prices and combat increasingly frequent brownouts. We'll join the conversation with Roberto explaining more about Argonaut's proposition.
Our model envisage a set of revenues generated by the host, by the customer, that accounts for like 30 to 45%, depending on what the customer wants and depending on the load of the customer. And then the rest, around 60%, is generated by the ancillary services. Ancillary services like frequency regulation or capacity market. So if we focus on the customer revenue, we have revenue like possibly UPS, uninterrupted power supply. So if we provide the UPS service to the customer, we get paid a certain amount of money under a long-term contract. But also by reducing their grid cost and sharing the savings, then we can further enhance our profile and add again a long-term contracted revenue. Obviously it's difficult to understand how much, because again grid charges are changing, and so we don't have visibility necessarily on the amount, but at least we have visibility on the revenue kind. So we know that we can contract for 12-15 years an item in our revenue stacking. Triads, for example, is a big part of our behind the meter revenue, and we know that triads will change, but at least there is a visibility over the next 5 years, which is helpful because also we try to amortize the battery within the period, and once the battery has been amortized, then it's a lot easier to take merchant risk, of course, because everything is upside. Once your equity has been repaid, it's a lot easier to make the number works.
And you're working with a lot of kind of big companies, water utilities, distribution firms, chemicals manufacturers, and Helen, putting it to you, if you're one of these kind of large energy users, how do you go about identifying a need for something like battery storage, which is, as Roberto says, essentially quite complex, in terms of its investment models, or kind of other forms of on-site generation?
I think Roberto touched on one of the key offers that you get from a battery storage or on-site solution, which is that uninterrupted power supply, and that is where the need will come from. So a number of large energy users are starting to experience brownouts on site, and that undoubtedly is going to drive them to approach people such as Roberto in this space. So it's that need for certainty and uninterrupted power supply. It's the price certainty or price clarity as well that this kind of solution can offer. There's also the green credentials, so a number of operators are offering green PPAs, for example. So all of these solutions offer a really good proposition to the large-scale energy user who is looking to understand how they can make their energy supply more certain in what is an increasingly uncertain economy that we're working within at the moment.
So drilling down into your model, I suppose, and how you win business, Roberto, how do you identify potential customers? Some of the kind of groups that I just mentioned, water utilities, distribution companies, and how do you make your proposition stand out in what could be a potentially quite crowded market?
Yeah, so our offer is basically a fully funded solution. So the customer doesn't put any capital up front. There's no capex for them, and normally there's no opex. Obviously, if they require something particular like UPS and the amount of backup power, they will have to pay for that capacity that we reserve for them, because obviously we won't be able to use that capacity to generate revenues through the ancillary services. When we structure the proposition at the beginning, we always put the customer at the center of the proposition, and I think that other offers probably lack this peculiarity. We have noticed that what is out there in the market has been structured on the back of PPAs, for example, or on other kind of solution where the customer actually take risk. What we try to do is de-risk the customer. We always say that worst case scenario for the customer is the same situation as it was before. They won't lose any money, and it takes time to make the customer understand that it's a risk-free proposition, and it takes time probably to teach the customer about what behind the meter storage is. Of course, the customer main concern is the connection. These customers rely heavily on electricity, of course, and having someone that comes on site and touches their connection is a big thing for them. They don't want someone that comes in and messes around and creates issues, and once the battery has been installed and then they leave, they need to fully trust the operation side of the battery, and they don't want to have people hanging around the battery, constantly coming on site and touching the battery. So our proposition is to make sure that the customer sees that we're working with professionals that have been doing this job for years, so they know how to install the battery, causing very little disruption to the operation of the customer. And then once the battery has been installed, they don't see us and they don't see the battery. They don't have to do anything. If I could paint the container in invisible paint, I'll do that, but we're not there yet. But we've noticed that talking to the customer and telling them how the process will go and how the operation will be of the battery, it gives them a lot of confidence. And so far we've received very good feedback from all our customers, potential customers.
In your model, there's no capital outlay for the customer, and what you're saying there is also, it's very invisible in as much as is possible.
Yeah.
So where does the reluctance stem from? These are, why isn't everyone, doing these? All large energy users, why are they not doing these solutions?
Do you think it's because this isn't their core business, and anything that has the potential to interrupt what the core business, what business as usual is, it is by its very nature incredibly high risk. So to have an unknown entity coming on, interfering with the connection, as Roberto's mentioned, construction work, you've got people, you've got interruption, you've got uncertainty in terms of impact on your workforce, on your deliveries, on movement around your site whilst construction works are underway. You've got third parties coming on, installing cables. This all very easily falls into the too hard pile when business as usual is hard enough. And that's why I think the key is educating the customer so that they understand it's actually a very short-term disruption, and the legal process, which is the angle that I would look at this from, doesn't need to be very complicated. We can have very straightforward documents that govern the land rights, that govern access onto the site, that will allow a customer to feel comfortable that business as usual will continue, both during the installation phase and then during the longer term relationship, because this is about building a long term relationship between the provider and the customer.
Exactly. Education is important for customers, and it takes time to acquire customers. We've recently signed an exclusivity with the water utility to install, to study, design and install and operate batteries on some of their sites. And I remember I started a year ago, and they've been very collaborative throughout the process. And we started with a certain contract to share the savings, but then through the education process they actually decided to opt for a different kind of contract, take a bit more risk but with potential higher upside. And we had multiple meetings where we involved our technical solution supplier. We worked on the solution around their needs, and also we introduced the aggregators so that they had a full picture of what they were getting into. As Helen said, this is not core to customer. It is in the sense that without energy they will not be able to carry out their daily operation, but this is not what they do. What they do is treat water. What they do is produce, bread, paper, glass, plastic, so on and so forth. And taking time off to think about, let's improve our carbon footprint, let's reduce our energy cost, let's improve our resilience, is not sometimes top of their agenda, unless, as you said before, they are being affected by brownouts, which we're seeing a massive increase of brownouts. I think the latest data reveals that brownouts in 2017 reached around 900 between brownouts and blackouts in the whole country, up from 400 in 2014. And this is because, of course, the grid is facing massive challenges of a lot of more renewable energy coming to the grid and a lot of the base load coming off the grid. So we will see more brownouts. Customer will experience more issues around that. I have to say, the customers that move the quickest are the ones that are being affected by brownouts, because for them is a cost, is a real cost. It deteriorates their machines, and it basically dents their competitiveness. Because if you can't, for example, fill the orders in time, your customers are not going to be happy. We have example of supermarkets being affected by brownouts, whereby they have fully automated distribution centers, and if they have a brownout, they are delayed in their deliveries to customers, and that means that they have to apologize by giving them a coupon of £15, for example. So that's a real cost. And to the fact that, of course, they lose competitiveness compared to their competitors, because their competitors deliver when they say they have to deliver, between 5 and 6 on a Tuesday night, and not the next day. Fair enough. And these are the customers that move quickly and want the battery as soon as possible.
So coming back to the education question, practically speaking, how do you sell like this proposition, bearing in mind the complexity and energy isn't their industry?
Sometimes I have to say they know a lot about what's happening, and they've been researching, they've been studying, they understand the drivers of this market. If there is an on-site generation, then that's quite easy to sell, because you basically sign a PPA with the customer that is lower price than what they will buy from the grid. That's an easy sale. On the battery side, it depends again on what their need is. Why are they doing it? And as Helen said before, again, she said some customer may do it for carbon credential, and we see that some customers, they need to meet certain target, and that's potentially the driver of having on-site generation and storage, of course. Other customers, they do it because of UPS. Other customers, they do it because potentially they see a lot of savings, and it's a way of increasing their competitiveness by cutting down cost where before wasn't really possible. A few years ago it wasn't possible to do it. Now reducing that OPEX is possible, and especially customers that are heavy in R&D, and they always looking for more money to invest in R&D, and if they can save OPEX and then take that savings and put into R&D, then there is a massive reason.
So on the education side, looking at this from the legal documentation, which is where my focus would be, the education is not only what Roberto's been doing in his discussions with the FD, but then it's my role to make sure that, you know, that the lawyers that are involved understand why the documents are in the shape that they're in, where the comfort sits for them to ensure that the core business can continue to operate, but equally why the battery solution or the on-site generation will need certain protections to ensure that it can operate and generate the revenues that it needs to be a fundable project. So there's an education around practically what will happen on site, how much access is needed, when access is needed, what happens when something goes wrong, what happens when something breaks. These are the practical concerns that drive the discussions that a lot of the legal documents will focus on, in terms of who is coming on site, and then also the land take, how much land is actually needed for these projects, where does it need to be located within the factory site, the industrial estate, whatever the particular real estate is that we're looking at. And that is just helping people in as simple things like really clear plans, just demonstrating what we're doing and where, and that we're not going to be entering into the factory floor. We're not going to be causing production to stop for extended periods of time while infrastructure is connected. These things can be done practically so that the interruption is kept as low as possible, because that is what is driving the attractiveness of these projects, which is lack of interruption to power supply, which is what is fundamental to these big energy users.
So last couple of questions, I suppose. Roberto, from an investment standpoint, it seems like a very fragmented market. Even though these are large energy users, we're talking maybe 1 or 2 megawatt batteries, I think. So how is it possible to scale up, and how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean that's probably the downside of operating in this business. Scale is an issue because, of course, on the investor side, investors, they don't want to move for a few millions. When you do a transaction, you have some fixed cost, and If the project is too small, then it doesn't make any economic sense. So we're looking at batteries that are above 500 kilovolt. If it's lower than that, then we want to be into a framework agreement potentially for 10, 20, 30, which is possible with water utilities, for example, because they have small pumping stations around the country, which is fine with us, but it has to be, into a framework agreement. You sign it once and then you roll it out.
And you can also then lever those economies of scale on the documentation side, so you can move towards more of a cookie cutter approach with the legal documentation, which just means that you can roll these things out much more quickly, cheaply, more efficiently.
Yeah, we started when we started looking at the contracts, we wanted to have standardized contract across, and soon realized that it's impossible because every customer has a particular need, and every battery is different, a different design. So having a portfolio, it really helps us because it reduces all these costs, and that you can have a cookie cutter approach. That's why we're targeting certain kind of customers. Scale is an issue, but we're trying to set up a network whereby we receive opportunities from, for example, technology suppliers, whereby they come to us with a customer that is already thinking about buying because they have a need and they don't want to put their own money. So at that point, scaling could be helped by this approach, and that's exactly how we are structuring our sales channels, basically. But sales for us is probably one of the main issues, together with, of course, the unpredictability of the revenue.
Okay, and just to close, people talk about a tipping point for battery storage. What does that mean as a first question, but also how close are we to a tipping point for batteries and or kind of on-site generation?
I think certainly in the UK, to date we've been using battery storage to provide short-term services, but I think looking globally, certainly the movement is towards longer duration batteries, and utilities, network operators, for example, are beginning to look at how batteries can be used for reserve power, for reinforcing the grid, particularly with all the challenges that the grid is facing because of the influx of solar and wind, the intermittency challenge that those bring to the grid and the grid infrastructure. So I think that we will see battery storage being used in a slightly different way going forwards as well.
Yeah, in my opinion, the tipping point is the point where the grid and customers finally understand the benefit of battery storage. Once that's widely understood, then it will be a demand-driven market. People will be asking for storage, whether front of the meter or behind the meter. Unfortunately, unlike solar and wind, the tipping point was basically the subsidies. We don't have subsidies, so we can't really rely on that to create the market. The market needs to be done needs to be created from the demand side, of course, from either customers behind the meter or front of the meter. And it will happen once people understand how batteries can be used to help the grid or to help their daily operations, basically, which I hope it will be pretty soon, because I think it's about time.
That's all from this webcast. My thanks to Helen and Roberto for their time and to Gowling for hosting. See you next time.